Well, I'd like to welcome you to the new Graduate Center of the City University of New York. I'm Steve Breyer. I'm the Associate Provost for Instructional Technology and External Programs, and it is the latter part of my title that puts me up on the stage tonight. I'm in charge of the continuing education and public programs here at the Graduate Center. And we are delighted that such a large and enthusiastic audience of New Yorkers has come to what will be, I think, an extraordinary evening, and one that will launch many evenings to come. This is the Gotham Center Forum Series on history. And Mike Wallace, who is the director of the Gotham Center and a Pulitzer Prize-winning author of the book Gotham, is going to make the introductions. But I wanted to welcome you tonight and encourage you to come back to the Graduate Center frequently. We have a catalog, which you saw on the table when you came in, the Continuing Education and Public Programming Catalog, that is filled with events such as this, many in the Gotham series that will be extending through the spring term, as well as many others. So we invite you to come back to participate in our public sessions, to take courses on a variety of subjects, and to get to know the Graduate Center of the City University, which is newly installed here in this magnificent building at the former B. Altman Department Store. It's my great pleasure, and it's easy to do because I've known him a long time, to introduce Mike Wallace. Mike and I have worked off and on together on public history projects for the better part of 25 years. You already know him as the person who co-authored Gotham, as the Pulitzer Prize winner for that book, but he's a man extraordinarily committed to public presentations of history. He believes that what we're doing tonight is the very essence of what historians should be doing, getting history out to as broad a public as possible. And we thought no better way to do that tonight than to have a program with Ric Burns and his wonderful series on New York City history. So without further ado, Mike Wallace.
Thank you. I'm delighted to welcome you here tonight for the first tangible sign that the fledgling Gotham Center for New York City history actually exists. The Forum Series, which we kick off tonight, will hopefully be just one of several projects collectively aimed at increasing the visibility of history on the New York civic landscape. We're going to try to do for history what the planetarium is about to do for the stars. We're going to develop a website that will pull together all of the history makers in the city and provide links to the general public. We're going to develop a program of developing curriculum packages on bringing New York City into the K-12 school system. We're going to start a history curators round table to hone in on presentations in the museums. And our most extravagant fantasy is a mammoth history festival to take place in October 2001 throughout the entire city after a kickoff weekend here at the Graduate Center. That's if we get the money, of course. We're in begging bowl mode just at the moment. So in fact, if anybody has any suggestions as to possible funders, they're most welcome. You can see me later, or Suzanne Wasserman. Suzanne, where are you? She was running around. Well, we'll introduce her when she comes back, who she's becoming the executive director of the Gotham Center. A flyer on the rest of the spring semester's offerings of the Forum Series is just out at the front door. And any of you who would like to be kept abreast of how we're doing, as Ed Koch would say, please sign up on one of the circulating pads or outside there. Name and email or snail mail address would be great. Now, to tonight. We're here to examine, with its makers, the recently aired and much remarked upon New York, a Documentary History. Now, there's a host of ways we could go about analyzing such a work. We could discuss the historical interpretations it advances, much as we would do those in a book. And indeed, there's already been much said and written, laudatory and critical alike, about how the film tackles such issues as race and gender, labor and ethnicity, capitalism and democracy. We could also tackle, more specifically, filmic issues, matters of cinematography and scoring, lighting and pacing, the balance of archival and scenic location shots, the problem of how to present such a scene entity as New York City, freshly, of how the film achieves some of its special effects. We could also, and this is where Rick is going to start, although he is open to discussing any and all of the aforementioned and yet other issues that you may care to bring up, what he's going to do is to try to look at both simultaneously, examining the interplay between written and filmic approaches at the way narratives get constructed in different media. I'll let him explain his own agenda after just a few words about his background. Rick wanted really to be a rock and roll drummer when he grew up, but he turned out, fortunately for us, to be a documentary filmmaker. He produced the PBS series The Civil War with his older brother Ken, earning 2 Emmys. After founding Steeplechase Films in 1989, he went on to direct The Way West in 1995, a 4-part documentary film on the history of the American West from 1845 to 1893, which garnered the Alfred I. DuPont Columbia Silver Baton Award and the Writers Guild of America Award for Outstanding Achievement. The Donner Party came in 1992. For that, he received a Peabody Award and 2 Emmy nominations for directing and writing. And then Coney Island, 1991. First Coney Island, sorry, 1991. For a historian, I have this occupational disability. I get names and dates bobbled all the time. Praised by the Chicago Tribune as, quote, one of the best documentaries you will ever see. The man writes, too, having turned out with colleagues companion books for the Civil War and now New York. He's also author of numerous articles, including studies of Rimbaud and Foucault, and he holds a BA and MPhil from Columbia and an MA from Cambridge. Rick is going to alternate speaking and showing an excerpt from the film until about 7:30, leaving us about an hour for questions and comments. In the Q&A period, he'll be joined by his collaborator, James Sanders, who co-wrote the narrative for both the film and book versions of New York. The multifaceted James is an architect, a graduate of both Columbia's and MIT's architecture schools, and he is also an author of a forthcoming book called Celluloid Skyline, New York and the Movies, a look at the century-long relationship between the city and film, soon to be a major public exhibit, and hopefully a forum of his own come next fall. Now, enjoy.
Thanks, Mike. It seems to me apropos to point out there's only one thing that you got wrong in that glowing and over-commendatory introduction, and that was the title of the film, New York, a Documentary History, you called it. And it was in fact called New York, a Documentary Film, and the pedant in me leaps to the rescue, not to sort of tongue lash you anyway, but I think that it's sort of the essence of what I think we should be discussing tonight, which is what would be the difference between New York, a documentary history, and New York, a documentary film. The film is a mode that conditions, like any media, so profoundly the material that it allows in, that is in a sense the essence of what our project was. It's not a history really, it's a film. But thank you for those wonderful remarks, and it's great pleasure and honor to be here to christen this series at the CUNY Center, thanks to Steve Breyer and especially to Mike Wallace, and for creating an opportunity for me and later for James as well to think out loud in public with you about New York, its history, and the challenges of bringing it to life on film, which is our particular dodge. The film itself has been a labor of love for James, who wrote it with me, and my partner Lisa Addis, who produced it, for about a decade, really. We began in 1992 to really seriously begin to think through what such a project would be. Along the way, inevitably, the collaboration grew and grew, including at one point about 25 people on our staff, researchers, editors, associate producers, my colleague Steve Revo, who's in the audience tonight, and many, many others. All of them left their mark on the film, but I want to take an opportunity, waste a moment here at the beginning, to point out and really extend my warmest thanks and deepest gratitude to the extraordinary team of historians and sort of historical writers who served as advisors to the project at one point or another, really virtually from the outset. Now, on camera and off, this extraordinary cadre of men and women who have made the city their passion and in some cases the focus of their life's work, enriched the film in more ways than James and Lisa and I could possibly enumerate. And while we may not have made it precisely as any one of them might have wished, it would be absolutely impossible to have made it without them. Graham Hodges, Pat Bonamy, we thank you, Kathy Pice, Christine Stansel, Carol Birkin, Craig Wilder, John Steele Gordon, Robert Stern, Nancy Gross, Caleb Carr, Jack Chen, Ann Douglas, Robert Caro, Marshall Berman, Philip Lopate, Pete Hamill, Luke Sant, Daniel Moynihan, John Mullenkoff, Gene Hauk, Allen Ginsberg, Virginia Sanchez Coral, Sam Warner, Steve Zeitlin, and above all, Mike Wallace and Ken Jackson, and Hope Cook. In this setting, with New York all around us, and with so many students of history and historians in the audience, and with our film done, or at least the first 10 hours done, another 4 will be finished later this year for broadcast sometime in early 2001, I think. I conceived tonight as an opportunity to do 4 things. First, I wanted to talk a little bit about what our ambition was in making the film, why we did it, what we wanted it to be, what the overall story was we hoped to convey, and how we chose to implement that narrative, given the nature of film, both the opportunities and the particular constraints that film poses. Second, I wanted to show a key passage from the film, about 35 minutes from the 4th episode of our film, a passage which focuses on the Triangle Shirtwaist Factory fire of 1911 and its aftermath. Third, I wanted to talk about the response to the film a little bit, which has been, for us, nothing short of amazing, in ways that are mainly gratifying, but also sometimes rather puzzling, some of which suggest that there is an enormous chasm, a kind of divide, separating academic historians from the general public. I hope that some of our conversation tonight and the question and answer periods might focus on what that divide is. It seems to me a very serious question and goes to the heart of what sort of the public presentation of history is all about. Then after that, fourth and finally, we'll open up the discussion for questions from the audience, which I hope are as vigorous and as provocative as possible with my wonderful colleague, James Sanders. Very quickly, our ambition in making the film was really quite simple. It really wasn't it wasn't a historiographical labor of love. Didn't come because we were sort of particularly erudite about New York City's history. It came out of a simple desire to explain, gazing at the skyline, say, of New York, and seeing in that sort of extraordinary image, sensing in it as we all do, that tremendous concentration of humanity, that tremendous concentration of energy, the seemingly inexplicable density of human enterprise, sprawling now over 4 centuries and 400 square miles in greater New York nearly. To try to answer the question, is there a way of explaining that? How did that come to be? Are there patterns that sort of shaped its rising? So it was a very simple and even kind of sort of existential beginning for us. How to make sense of this sort of whirling dervish of a city that we all live in. And it was a crucial thing that we would never have sat down to write a history. We were going to make a film. And what that meant right from the beginning was that we were never going to be able to do something encyclopedic, nor would we be able to do something even exhaustive or comprehensive. It was very fortunate that as our project was aborting, 2 extraordinary written works were aborting, the Encyclopedia of New York City and Mike Wallace's and Edwin Burroughs' Gotham. We therefore had as examples both what we weren't going to do, and both Ken Jackson and Mike Wallace in extraordinary acts of sort of generosity and camaraderie in the pursuit of making history, made available to us before their works were published, texts that turned out to be seminal in many ways and shaped our thinking, and for which we're extremely grateful. But we weren't going to do an encyclopedia, and we weren't going to do an exhaustive, comprehensive narrative of the kind that Gotham is so extraordinarily the first half of. We were going to do a film, and some extremely basic things condition what a film is. In my view, and I have yet to ever have this successfully disputed with me, film is essentially a narrative medium. We know that because film runs through the gate of a motion picture camera and of a projector at 24 frames a second in one direction. It's like a kind of a continuous river of light and shadow and now sound, which, although we can now with VCR stop it, the point of a film is that it doesn't stop. We don't stop to analyze it. It moves along and carries us with it. And so its very being as a genre, as a medium, is narrative. And that obvious fact conditions tremendously what you can do when you're narrating history. There's a kind of law that governs how much detail you can put in a film. I think most historians would be startled to discover that each one of the 2-hour film scripts in our series is 37 pages long and about 12 to 14,000 words. I mean, that's, to give you any, I mean, if you have any sense of how many words are on a page, that's a startling fact to consider. There's so little information, relatively speaking, in a film, verbal information in a film. And beyond that sort of parsimony of information, there's the fact that a film always wants to have a clear, coherent, central narrative to it. And now, the city itself, there's no example of the kind of film we made before. There's no history of New York on film that you could go to see. We had no Bible for making this film. And the chief thing that we were trying to create was a series of stories, each of which was clear and simple while you were receiving it, which meant that we had to choose, and choose radically and dramatically all the time. When we were in the Dutch period, we had to say, what's the one story? What are the key figures we're going to emphasize on? In a book, in a history, obviously in an encyclopedia, one can be widely discursive. One can qualify and add nuance and detail. That would be death to a film. No one would stay around for a film made on that model. And we chose, I think, wisely not to do so. What that meant, in a sense, was that the extraordinary richness of the city's history, we had to, in a sense, first engage our audience so powerfully in whatever story we were telling that they wouldn't leave while we were doing that. And then second of all, ask for them to make a leap of faith with us. That even though we wouldn't and didn't want to give in a kind of a complete slice of life at every moment in New York's history, that over time, longitudinally, so to speak, we would create incrementally an impression of the density and variety of behavior and enterprise that took place in the city. So that if we didn't do something that was part of labor history in the first hour, maybe we would in the second hour. If we didn't treat an aspect of social history in the second episode, maybe we would get around to that in the fourth. If we didn't treat the kind of the capital, the commercial history of the city in every episode, perhaps at key moments, at those points when it would be most pertinent to delve into that, you would get that. And that was indeed our sort of modus operandi as we went through. We decided to pick our battles very, very carefully and fight them when it would be most fruitful from within this shining river of light and sound to fight them, and not try to fight each and every battle of New York's history every time, every episode, every decade, every century. So what is the story that we're trying to tell? It's very easy to repeat. We came to the conclusion that there's a simple narrative that the entire architecture of New York's history can be housed within, and it's a narrative which is a very American narrative. It's a narrative of the rise of the two principal American impulses or forces, capitalism and democracy, commerce and diversity, on the banks of the Hudson 400 years ago. The rise of those forces before there was anything that people called America, before there was a United States. And so interestingly that it began in New York, and it began with the Dutch. It began with a community which was distinct from the other colonies, most of the other colonies in North America, because it was not a religious colony. It was not dedicated explicitly to an ideological or religious proposition. Very swiftly, by not being Quaker Philadelphia and not being Puritan Boston, the number and kinds of people who found it convenient or even possible to settle in the greater New Amsterdam, New Netherlands area skyrocketed. The famous cliched statistic is that by 1643, 19 years after the founding of the colony, there were 18 languages spoken on the streets of what would become New York City. What that means is that you see in this story that we wanted to begin carefully and very simply putting together is a crucial relationship between commercial activity and the diversity of the culture that began to be included in that area, between what we later came to call capitalism and democracy. And it's our thesis, and I think it's a very simple-minded thesis, but simple-minded theses I would maintain are the best ones for film, for the reasons that I've already tried to allude to, is that this intertwining of capitalism and democracy, commerce and diversity in New York, never harmoniously, always acting in tension, has created over time one of the most transformative and creative human cultures the world has ever seen. So that having found our two chunks of uranium and seen how they were being put together into a kind of critical mass in New York over 4 centuries, we wanted to sit back and tell in a series of stories strung together like a necklace the rise of this extraordinarily creative, incredibly complex human construct, New York City. And I would be kidding myself and not being fully honest if I didn't say that at the heart of that was a sense that my colleagues, James Sanders and Lisa Addis and I, had from the very beginning, was that it was not a dispassionate or objective view of New York. It was finally an extremely subjective and a very personal view of New York. That New York might be, in fact, one of the important places of the world. That there might be achievements that, at its best, New York has represented for world culture, which are worth holding on to. That, warts and all, if you look at that history, if you sequence those stories over 400 years, what you see is a culture which has been arguably, though always imperfectly and never sufficiently, more inclusive, more tolerant, more creative, more dynamic than most other places. And that further, that dynamism comes from that ruthless commercial activity and the enormous numbers of people that engine has drawn in. So that's the story. And the challenges that we had in putting together that story were many, because it simply was, it's very easy to sit here and generalize and float out what our narrative architecture was. The real work of the film was not arriving at that thesis. The real work of the film was painstakingly, frame by frame, scene by scene, segment by segment, episode by episode across the entire 10-hour series, 14 hours when it's done this time next year, a film that engaged people, that actually kept them there, that didn't talk down to them, but did not presume that they knew anything about New York, didn't presume they didn't know anything about New York, just presumed that they might be able to be engaged if we got to the core of what was most humanly interesting about the stories that we were stringing together. That work was as challenging as anything I've ever done. I hope that the scene the 35-minute, 37-minute scene that I'm about to show you is in certain ways illustrative of some of the kind of the general points I've made right now. And when it's done, I want to talk a little bit about the response to the film, which has been interesting. The clip is from the end of the 4th episode, which treats the immigration, the big wave of new immigration at the turn of the century, from around 1885 to 1924. And the overall story of the episode, which is called The Power and the People, is the way the immigrants in coming in transformed, obviously, the city's demography, but more importantly, transformed its physical plant tremendously in a surge of infrastructural transformation that took place in the first couple decades of the century. And even more importantly, and I think long-lastingly, for American culture, transformed the city's culture politically. And that's, of course, the story that's at the heart of the story of the labor movements, of the reform movement, of the social welfare reform movement that really began to take off in the first decade of this century and came to this spectacular, sort of cataclysmic culmination at the time of the Triangle Shirtwaist Factory fire. Without further ado, let's roll that clip, and I'll have a few remarks afterwards before we go on to the question and answer section. The trick, I think, of making documentary films, of making history on film, not documentary films, historical documentaries, is not to make the past come alive. I think it's kind of like a weird cliche we use. The past is dead and gone. It's to use the actually extremely minimalistic, austere repertoire of techniques available in filmmaking to create an experience on film which has sufficient aesthetic and emotional and intellectual intensity that intensity itself becomes an experience for the audience. And they make the leap then for you and associate that experience, if it's been intense enough, with the past that's obviously vanished and gone. And that's a very specific vocation that narrative history, and especially film history,
solve the question of the Big Apple. He didn't explain that. Is he here tonight? Okay. Let's move on to the last portion. Just a couple of audience demographic questions, because this is our first night. How many of you would consider yourselves to be members of the Guild of Historians? That is to say, somehow you actually earn a living off that business somehow or another. Any professional historians in the crowd? A lot of you, all right. How about professional filmmakers, just out of curiosity? What, history buffs, let's say? Okay. Concerned New York citizens? Where's the rest of you? There we go. Okay. All right. What we're going to do is the following. We're going to take questions, and we have a variety of mechanisms. One, if you've got a really big, strong voice and you can project vigorously, stand up and bellow. If you do not, you have two options. One, there's a mic, standing mic on this side, and if you're near there and you don't mind standing up for a bit, you can queue over there. And Steve, Oprah, Breyer over here will walk up and down with this mic, which stretches, we're not sure how far, and pass it down to people to ask questions. We're going to go until 8:30. After that, those of you who are inclined and have brought a rolling shopping cart along with you and would like to buy one or the other or both of the books that are going to be on sale outside, then Rick and James and I would be delighted to sign them. That's it for the commercial break. Okay, having said that, sir.
First of all, if it's any consolation to you, 1 star plus 5 stars averages out to 3 stars, not 2.5 stars. That's just going to get things started.
Okay. Sir. Now, are you hearing him in the back? 2 years ago, he projected 36 hours of Gotham's was in the offing. Have I got this right?
As a joke, mate. I don't know.
No. It's always been 10, and then expanded to 14 in the last year or so.
Yes, ma'am.
Yes, it is.
It's the Ash Company building. It's now owned by NYU. The floors have been renovated many times over. It's Washington Place in Green Street, northwest corner.
Yes, sir.
First of all, I'm very impressed with the film that you made and very interested in your rationale for how you made it. But it seems to me your very rationale and explanation of how a filmmaker looks at a documentary and how a historian would look in itself explains why you have this problem. Historians, by the nature of what they do, are interested in all of the elements that make up history. And you as a filmmaker are interested in the elements that are of most interest both to you and to an audience. And there's a great void between the two, because you can't include everything, whether you'd like to or not, and a historian, by the very nature of what he or she does, must. There are no such things as valid history books that skip chapters about various times in history. They have to include all of them, for better or worse. And therefore, there's a dichotomy here that I don't think you can solve, and I don't think you're going to get the review that you would like to have based on the filmmaker's premise that look at us like we are a film and a creative aesthetic documentary as opposed to an historic document, because historians look at things like this as historic documents.
I think it's a very, very shrewd sort of statement. I'd say this, though. I mean, for us, the pain of not being able to win the approbation that we wish from as wide a spectrum of the historical community is really sort of like not the issue. I mean, that's a kind of like, you know, that's an issue of vanity for a filmmaker and not an important one. I think the important issue, however, has to do with how the historical community addresses a general audience as opposed to the way it addresses essentially an audience of its own guild members. And I think that what's unfortunate is the degree to which there's that some of the tendencies which you've described and which I was trying sort of less eloquently to point to in the historical community, in the Guild of Academic Historians, tends to actually inhibit the communication with a broad audience, and indeed see that as what somebody in one of these online reviews call it, like middlebrow. Like we're a middlebrow film, talking to a middlebrow audience. And suddenly already you begin to see that that division, the gap grows wider. I mean, who are we speaking to when we're speaking historically? And it seems to me that if you don't want to essentially cultivate a culture which becomes historically and historiographically illiterate, there has to be historically serious work that's intended for a general audience. Otherwise, that general audience simply won't know the great stories, the important stories, or any stories at all historically about its culture. And that's, I think, the important issue to raise and address.
I agree with you, but if that's your premise, then I don't think you can worry about what historians say. You've got to worry about what you have to say and how you can communicate to that audience. And when you're as you've been dealing with New York, and New York is a place that people are still living in, and a lot of the things that happened, there are people alive who lived through them, as opposed to the Civil War where that was not the case. So you have a lot more of a critical mass of people who can come at you in a way that would not have happened with the Civil War. But you've got to worry what you're promoting and what you're trying to exhibit as a filmmaker, and not worry about what professional historians have to say, as long as what you're doing you feel is valid.
Well, as a professional historian, before I turn to the other side, let me just throw in one quick comment to that, too. I think to some extent there's a philosophical, epistemological problem here. No historian, even one as logoretic as I am, who is willing to massacre entire forests to get his message across, is in fact ever going to be able to in fact tell everything. All history is, in fact, the product of selection. It embodies silences. It embodies the choices that the person who is asking the questions of the past and deciding which material he wants to assemble for that answer, that's built into the genre. So to some extent, I think that's a misleading dichotomy. There may be interesting questions for us to explore in the kind of constraints that are imposed on people who are working with film as their medium as opposed to text, but I don't think you can say that the text folks are in fact capable of doing everything and not leaving out chapters. Every history leaves out tons of things. Yes, sir.
You actually took my
Oh, I'm
question.
sorry.
And, but I just want to say I did enjoy the film as much as I have seen. I saw about 6 hours of it. But I have a question that maybe is tied to the prior question, which is, as a filmmaker, well, first of all, what are your politics? And as a filmmaker, how much did you have to battle with what you included in your film, telling this narrative of New York City's history? And what choices did you make and your colleagues make in deciding what you would put in and what you would put out? I mean, the Triangle Factory issue made compelling viewing, maybe more so than, you know, the drudgery of building a railroad from a robber baron point of view, perhaps. Maybe not. And I just want to know what insight you could give to us as how you made your choices. Was it first and foremost what would look best on film, or was it the actual historical record?
I think the criteria are many. I think that one has to commit to creating a portrait which is in some way balanced, so that no matter what your own preconceptions or political viewpoints or wherever your sympathies may lie, it's important to create a picture of the world which has some sort of, can be adjusted to reality by people other than yourself. You don't just have to buy your party line. I think the most surprising thing for me, growing up in Ann Arbor, Michigan in the 1960s and 70s, was to discover how much a kind of, a sort of a liberalism, even radicalism, sort of kind of that came in with my mother's milk. In a sense, I feel kind of went by the board in this project because, you know, New York is not only a place about labor movements and revolutionary sort of moments of progress from a left point of view in the city's culture. And to write that history or to film that history and present it as the history of New York would simply be wrong. You wouldn't be telling the history of New York. And the two pumpkins we put in our saddle bag, you know, capitalism and democracy, ended up taking these two things which, in many ways, people think of them as, at the very least, in tension, if not absolutely sort of violently opposed as forces in American life. And to try to see in the city, to begin to see in the kind of, in parts of the city's history, how those forces actually interacted with each other. So that at key moments it became clear that for the interests of capital itself, you were going to have certain kinds of popular democratic breakthroughs, and vice versa. And so I think that there was, the most surprising thing to me was that way in which one put into abeyance one's own feelings and tried to see the city as a kind of natural phenomenon with its own dynamic. Having said that, I think that the bias that we never surrendered was that, which we went into and which we have come out with, is the bias I mentioned at the beginning, a sense that warts and all, if we're going to make it as a human community, my guess is we're going to make it, however much this might be abhorrent to people who live in Kansas, in some place like New York. That the kind of the experiment in a multicultural, diverse, global society began in places like New York. New York has the longest and oldest and most interesting experience with that kind of global culture. That's what the Dutch were founding when they left Holland to come here and begin a culture that had 18 languages spoken on its streets 20 years after they found it. And so I think that just to say we're unembarrassed or unashamed at simply saying that's the experiment we see New York City as having been engaged in inadvertently for 400 years. And insofar as we approve of that experiment and want to see that experiment widened, then probably works. It probably still works. It'll hold an audience. That quality, that simple existential feature, it's holding an audience, is the main passport for admission into a film, and it's obverse is the truth. If it doesn't work, in a sense, almost no matter how important it is, it hits the cutting room floor and you go, gee, we'll have to try to make that point down the road in a different way with something that does work. And that's what's on the cutting room floor, I hope, the boring stuff.
I would actually say that was the hardest challenge of the film, and I'd say in a funny way, and in answer to this gentleman's question as well, we realized, I think relatively early on, looking at the sort of array of historical material that we were confronting to work with, on the one hand, there were enormous sort of statistical surveys of the city's history. You could tell the story in terms of its population statistics and 1,000 other ways of looking at sort of the behind-the-scenes, underlying, unfolding forces that were going on in the city's history. On the other hand, there were a series of incredibly colorful, exciting events and moments. And we realized on the one hand, you could make a film that was just a sort of a string of wonderful anecdotes. They were just incredible moments. On the other hand, you could make a probably less interesting film that was just a sort of underlying series of people talking about what were the underlying forces in the city's history. The trick, it seemed, was to try to do both, was to try to find ways in which You found the moments that were enormously exciting and enormously compelling, and then you tried to elucidate from them, as best you could, what they meant. And I'm quite proud looking at this sequence that I think that's exactly what we tried to do here. We could have just shown you the Triangle Fire. It's a mesmerizing event in New York City's history. It would have been very, very gripping. What I'm enormously proud of what we've tried to do is not only show you this gripping thing, but explain to you what it means to you. Frances Perkins went on to be the first Secretary of Labor and first woman cabinet member in American history and the Secretary of Labor under Franklin Roosevelt, and fought for things like Social Security. So now if you expect a Social Security payment at the end of your life, maybe it has something to do with the fact that that woman stood on that sidewalk and watched those women fall. So the meaning of that, it comes out, and we're balancing all of that material. And we don't just have to defend it as sort of an impressionistic thing, but something which tries to show the unfolding of those forces.
Yes, sir.
Mr. Burns, first I'd like to thank you and your colleagues for a magnificent contribution to the city of New York. My question has to do with effect, which I think sounds more to be a theatrical term than an historical one. I noticed, and some friends of mine, having viewed the videotape, that it seems at first that the documentary is divided into a relatively few major epics, and even within, well, the logistical breakup that is the tape, even within one tape or one section, there are relatively few topics that are going to be discussed. Yet, at the end, you literally feel as if you've learned hundreds, if not thousands, of things about New York City without ever having been lectured at. Now, my question specifically is, was that effect designed, or did it just happen?
Boy, we'll never get a better
It's a softball across the plate.
better question or review than that. I mean, a serious primary motive in the film was to explain New York. And the explanations turn out to be, in some sense, relatively simple. And so the large architecture of the series has to do with making it clear how the harbor itself, the arrival of the Dutch, the importance of the slavery to the economy of the English when they took over, the Erie Canal, which opened in 1825, the Civil War, the tremendous wave of immigration at the turn of the 20th century, the Triangle Shirtwaist Factory fire, later in the series episodes to come, the Depression and the New Deal. These are the some of the big and medium-sized things in which, when you understand them, when you look at them correctly, they shed in a tremendous amount of light. Suddenly what seemed like incoherent terrain and terra incognita suddenly becomes familiar. And I think that the effect you're talking about is a result of a couple of things happening. When landscape that seems incomprehensible becomes clear, and then you add a few powerful details on top of that. The simple human delight, sort of pedagogical, educational delight, the joy at feeling chaos abate and clarity come forward, stands for, it's almost an emotional reaction that we have, although it begins as a cognitive one. And I think that what people sense in the film, because I think it's what we sensed as we began to make sense of the material, is this delight. Think of the doors that are unlocked by the Erie Canal. Suddenly you feel like even though it's one thing, suddenly you feel that you've had a tremendous vista opened up that you didn't know existed before, if you hadn't known that before, as most people, including us, hadn't. Then if within that vista you add a few salient facts, the impression is that you've actually opened up an entire continent of knowledge, whereas in fact all you've done, if you've done it right, is, with as much shrewdness as you can muster, say a few of the things in the right order at the right time and create the sense of an explosion of information, whereas in fact all you've done is wave 2 or 3 flags like a semaphore.
Thank you very much. Thank you.
Yes, sir.
I mean, somebody else will. That's the thing. I mean, someone else will pick up the performance and take this basic ground of material, New York's history, and do it in a different way. And obviously there are millions of unmade films and books and poems about New York that have yet to be made, and this is just sort of one of them. I'm glad to hear that you're a composer, because I think that it allows me to make a point which I feel is crucial to understanding film, which is that film always wants to be music. And it doesn't want to be, for example, a history book, even if it's a historical film. It aspires to the condition of music, and that the way a film works, if it works well, is the way a piece of music works. And it has at its disposal notes, words, images, and sound effects, but all of them are disposed as notes in a composition are disposed, each with their own value that lasts for a particular period of time, that contrasts or harmonizes with other notes. And that's why music works so powerfully in film. It's as if when you get the right piece of music in a scene, it's telling the scene you're home. You've come to what rhythmically and emotionally you most want to be, and you've been trying to be the whole time. And so I think film is forever destined to be this kind of bastard, orphaned form, trying to get back to its parent music, and always only imperfectly doing so.
See, somebody in the back of the room there. Okay, and then you, sir. Oh, yes, that's right. I thought I saw your hand. Sorry, we'll come back to you.
Mr. Burns, I wanted to say that I really enjoyed your presentation on Channel 13, but I'm not sure if I watched everything of yours because I accidentally came across it, and I know I couldn't tear myself away from it. It was just so wonderful. And I'm not sure how the beginning went, but I enjoyed the part of the Empire State Building, you know, where it was shown that it was built within a year, I believe.
13 months.
Oh, 13 months, where they rushed to do it. And I was thinking of, it took, I believe, 2 years to make the Kip Spade Theater, and I was thinking how horrible in relation to the Empire State Building.
I know. And it took us 10 years
And
to do
I
this
thought they
series.
didn't design it right, and it took them a lot longer to do that.
No, it's really, I mean, that building is the great rebuke to almost all human accomplishment, given how quickly put out.
Yes.
Unfortunately, that you saw in the Empire State Building only the last half an hour of the 10-hour series, but I'll hum and whistle and recite the rest of it for you.
Oh, can I ask you how it started out?
What's that?
Can I ask you how your documentary
Oh,
started out?
I think
No, I
I think
mean,
that's
what-
problematic. But there's a 5-package videotape, and it'll, I'm sure, be replayed again. But we can't ask poor Rick to
Can I
start
just
from
ask
scratch.
you one more thing? Do you think you'll show it on Channel 13 again?
Yes, it will be rebroadcast.
Oh,
It has been broadcast 5 times already, and they'll continue.
You don't
to
know
do
when it will be rebroadcast?
they've kind of like broadcast it so many times in the last 2 months that they're going to give it a rest for a little bit. But
Okay, thank you very
maybe
much.
next fall.
Thank you. Good evening. My name is Brian Mcginnis. I recently authored a book on the Bedford-Stuyvesant community, and my next project is to produce a film or documentary. And my question is, how and where do I get funding or finances to produce a project?
I'd go to the public television station, WNET in New York, and talk to executive producers there. Because they're kind of a critical, they won't necessarily give you money, they probably won't. But that is a kind of critical strategic relationship to begin by igniting enthusiasm, sharing your enthusiasm for a project with somebody, a public television executive who, if they are interested in seeing it on their air, will become a collaborator as you go out looking for money. There are very few sources of money for films in the sense that makes it both hard and easy. The National Endowment for the Humanities, PBS itself, the Corporation for Public Broadcasting, foundations, and sometimes corporate underwriters are where you go to fund these kinds of films. if it's a series like this, you need all those players involved to piece together the kind of multi-million-dollar budget. But the first place to go to is a public television station with your idea, preferably in some kind of written form, so that they can see that it's not just the glimmer of an idea, but you've begun to give it some kind of shape, a shape that makes sense to them.
Yes, sir. Maybe you can grab that.
That's okay.
You know, there's not, none of the really dramatic pieces of history that I've had the opportunity to treat on film, either in the New York series or elsewhere, a film I did on the Donner Party a few years ago, 1992. Each one of those has made me wonder, gee, they're like a kind of a poison that never gets out of your system. The Triangle Fire, the draft riots, the Donner Party, because you don't purge yourself of them by kind of treating them that way, and you always go, the next step is always exactly what you just said. What kind of dramatic film could you make out of it? But I so far haven't, and I think that, it's not that I won't, but I think that part of it is that there's a particular poignancy that comes from the presentation of the story as real. That is there in any documentary, any nonfiction presentation. That the simple fact that you know that those were the real photographs, that you assume and you trust the filmmakers that those are the real facts. That those are the real, not sights and sounds, but that the documents themselves are bringing you close to the real event. There's a kind of a poignancy about being close to the fragments of a now gone reality that is subtly woven into the experience that you have, which is missing even when you do it, even when you say this is a fictionalized treatment of a real event, and all the names are the same and these events really happen. The minute the scrim of fictionality falls across the presentation, that simple connection that you have, sort of like that kind of thing that when people who collect artifacts, dum-dum bullets from the mini balls from the Civil War, it brings them physically close to the past. There's a certain way in which documentary film always has that vocation. It's handing you the mini ball. And if it's a fictionalized presentation, you know it was produced, you know, in Hollywood. And it takes away a particular kind of, more than I think frisson, a particular kind of connection which is subtle and is only part of the mix, but which is, I think, sort of crucial. So I think for a while, at any rate, unless I want to start doing something different, I'll stick to this form.
Yes, sir. Can you be heard back there?
Triangle factory piece, there was a pilgrimage of pedestrians, a lot of NYU students, given its proximity, and people were just surrounding it, looking up, and we all sort of realized what we were doing. We were looking up, and that scene was incredibly powerful.
That's so moving.
More so than I think any dramatization could be. But what I'd like to do is ask you, in the spirit of the woman at the Cooper Union, to be more specific on some of the outtakes or things not necessarily that didn't get on the cutting room floor, but that were debated. Because part of the interesting element of this series, I thought, was trying to predict what subsequent episodes would have, and that was a lot of fun, but I missed a couple.
The Harlem Renaissance, I think one of the failures of the series, from my point of view, had to do with our treatment of New York in the 1920s, which is the last episode that appeared this fall. Treated the shortest period of any of the 5 episodes, just 1919 to 1931, from Armistice through the crash and the building of the Empire State Building. But it was such a condensed and powerful period in the city's history. And I feel that we did not find a way of sufficiently metabolizing all the material that we wanted to and make it into 109 minutes, which is what each of these films roughly is. And that the thing that hit the floor with a resounding clang was about 20 minutes on the Harlem Renaissance. Now, the Harlem Renaissance appears in the film, but kind of floats in and out very quickly. It's like a little two-step and it's gone. whereas in fact we'd had a whole scene in which you understand how Harlem had initially been pioneered as a middle-class neighborhood for white New Yorkers, mainly immigrants on their way up. The railroad, the subway boom had caused a explosion of housing being built in Upper Manhattan. Harlem real estate was going begging, and it began in the first decade of the century for the first time to be pioneered as a black residential neighborhood, and the first stable neighborhood African Americans had in the history of African Americans in New York, the second oldest ethnic group after the Dutch, arriving in 1626, 2 years after it was founded. So it was a very important moment, and the creation of Harlem and its rise as a kind of a black Mecca was seen as a crucial, but it began to run away with the narrative. In and of itself, it was powerful. But in the context of the entire episode that we're dealing with, it ended up beginning to feel like the tail that was wagging the dog. We knew it was wrong to simply clip it as much as we did, and we didn't ever do the thing which would have been most satisfying, which is to find kind of the third way to sort of, as I say, metabolize it better. And I think that there are probably 5 or 6 moments that throughout the series were insufficiently metabolized, and we had to let them go.
We called the third episode Sunshine and Shadow, based on the very popular guidebook metaphor of the time. And we wanted to do a scene that would actually interrogate that metaphor. And we had wonderful talking heads, Danny Sitram and other people, talking about this was the way of seeing the city. It had come from Dickens, and it had sort of taken a New York form with these kind of Protestant ministers writing these books about, oh, how terrible New York is, tell me more, more, more. And that it was this really kind of very deliberately exaggerated way of seeing New York, which has, of course, gone on right through the 20th century. No middle class in New York, only the richest rich and the poorest poor, the best, the greatest and the worst. And it would have been a wonderful scene to include, which would have in part explained the title of the film, and also perhaps suggested that we ourselves recognized that we were using it as a kind of in a knowing way as a metaphor. It proved just almost impossibly difficult to make a compelling, interesting scene out of these guidebooks, even though we found them fascinating. It just didn't work.
Time for just a couple more. Yes, ma'am.
I think that the first task of any film is to create a waking dream state in people. And you know that kind of experience you have when you go out of the theater, especially if you go to the movies in the afternoon, and you feel sometimes pleasantly, sometimes unpleasantly bizarre as you walk around the streets? That's because you've actually been asleep, although you're totally awake at the same time. And I remember, all of us have had this experience. I do it all the time now that I'm a filmmaker. You look sideways in a packed movie audience while the film was running. And the most moving and electrifying thing, if the movie is working, is happening. Every face is tilted up in exactly the same way, totally motionless, fixed on the kind of vanishing point of the screen. What's happening is, in fact, a very simple and dumb physical reality is taking place. Light and shadow and sound is flickering across that screen. But that's not what the audience has experienced. The audience is doing something, and this is the dream part, is projecting a belief. They're believing in a reality actually much more, much greater than the simple frame of action and sound they're being exposed to. They believe in a simple existential way that there's, an upstairs and a downstairs to the apartment they're seeing, that there's a left and a right, that there's a before and an after. They're thinking about, they begin to believe if the film is doing its work, there's a whole set of coordinates that are not being presented, which they're concerned about. Why is this happening? What's going to happen? The key narrative question. The thing that's not happening now, what's going to happen in the future? When you begin to enlist people's emotions through the aesthetics of film, then it's working as film. Doesn't matter if it's a feature film, if it's a slideshow, if it's a historical documentary film. Once you've got them dreaming, if you're a historical documentary filmmaker, then the audience is in an extremely vulnerable state to be moved and taught by what you have. And therefore, you have an enormous responsibility because you've effectively sort of hypnotized them, and they're going to believe it. So you must be, in some high sense, faithful to reality in your presentation. But that's what the job is. So it's really two jobs. Make them dream, and then while they're dreaming, give them truth.
Let me just toss in one quickie on that score. I mean, in terms of the question of the job of the historian and or the filmmaker, whichever medium you're working in, the question of teaching is extremely important, and the question of truth is very important. But for me, what that means is that the definition of job is as varied as the variety of people who step up to the megaphone and try to use it. There is politics in this film. There's politics in my book. There's a lot of politics in that segment that you just saw. I'm not sure how many of you read this column, but John Tierney, one of my least favorite New York Times columnists, wrote a piece savaging the film, and unwisely, in my judgment, chose this particular segment on which to hang his hat. And he did so because he was saying what this was a closet argument for the importance of the state in intervening in and regulating the private working of the economy. And as a thoroughgoing laissez-faire person who traces, in fact, most of the problems of society not to the economy but to the polity, he said this is, in fact, agitprop. I mean, unfortunately, he also was wrong in a lot of the specifics when he attacked this, but he wasn't wrong to be sensing that there is a strong point of view embodied in this film. And there are plenty of academic historians, in fact, whose goal is to sort of simply explain an obscure moment in the past on its own terms and have no sense that, in fact, they're trying to communicate some truth or to persuade people of anything. But in fact, it's very, very, very hard to find any such animal as an objective, value-free piece of historical research. The job is, to some extent, implicit in the person who is making that presentation. You're telling a story. You want to entertain if you're smart, and that goes for history as well, in text form as well as in film form. But you want to indeed entertain, usually to a purpose. And to the degree that you're clear about that in either your film or your book, I think that's an important aspect of, in fact, being upfront about what it is you're after. And I think the film is, in fact, quite straightforward. But it's not neutral. It's not value-free. It's, you know, it does have a variety of agendas. I mean, I just happen to agree with most of them. Do you hear that? The gentleman wants to know basically what Ric's up to next.
Well, we're finishing this series. The 10 hours came down to 1931, first 10 hours, and the last 4 will pick up the story roughly from the 1920s and bring it down to today. It was sort of an irony to us that we kind of got into telling the story of the history of New York via Robert Caro's work on Robert Moses. As so many people, sort of one of the first, that book kind of rises like the sun in many people's lives. As controversial as it is in many ways. And my first desire to work on such a project actually came from reading The Power Broker. And so it was ironic that we didn't get to the Moses part of the story in the first 10 hours. And there's many ways in which we feel that the first 10 hours is now sort of set the table for this tremendous story, epic story of the transformation of New York from the 1920s down through the 1960s. Because of the automobile, because of the Depression, because of the New Deal, because of tremendously powerful changes in the relationship between the federal government and the city that took place. So that's really where we're kind of like living and breathing right now, is in this kind of really, to us, riveting story of New York from the time of the Depression on down through Moses's fall from power and grace in the 1960s. And we'll finish telling the story. I have a couple of other projects on a biography of O'Neill, Eugene O'Neill, a sort of a wonderful, dark story which is sort of dear to my heart, and a film about Andy Warhol, which I'm really interested in.
Well, I think that should hold us. The answer there really is stay tuned. And thank you so much for coming. Rick and James will be outside at that long table if there's anybody who wants to purchase a book and have them scribble in it. And me too. Thanks again.
Thank you.